there is a habit that never announces itself. It does not look like laziness, and it does not look like failure. It looks like silence. It looks like the moment you feel a small tightening in your chest when you think about your bank balance, and instead of looking, you look away. You tell yourself you will check later. You tell yourself today is not the right day. And somewhere in that quiet turning away, a pattern begins to take root, one that will shape your financial life far more than any single mistake ever could. You may not call it avoidance. You may call it being busy. You may call it not wanting to stress yourself out. You may call it waiting until things calm down before you look closely. But underneath those explanations is something simpler and harder to admit. There is a part of you that has learned it is safer not to know than to know and feel afraid. This is not a story about being irresponsible. Most people caught in this pattern are hardworking. They show up. They do their jobs. They care for the people around them. And yet, quietly, in the space where their financial life should be examined, there is a fog they have learned to live inside. Not because they are weak, but because somewhere along the way, looking closely at money became associated with shame, or fear, or old memories they never fully processed. Tonight is not about guilt. It is about something gentler and more useful. It is about understanding why this silent habit forms, how it slowly shapes a life, and what it actually takes to walk back toward clarity, one honest look at a time. Perhaps you have noticed it in small ways. The bank app you open and close within 2 seconds, refusing to let the numbers fully register. The unopened envelope left on the counter for 3 days longer than it should be. The vague sense of your financial situation, built more from feeling than from fact. Sometimes the mind protects itself by staying in the fog because the fog, uncomfortable as it is, feels less frightening than seeing the truth in full detail. You may find yourself telling a story about your money that has not been checked against reality in months, maybe years. The story might be worse than the truth, or it might be better, which is its own kind of danger, because a person who believes their situation is fine when it is not will never build the habits required to change it. There are moments when you almost look. Your hand hovers over the banking app. Your mind almost opens the spreadsheet. And then something interrupts you, a phone call, a task, a wave of tiredness, and the moment passes quietly the way most avoidance passes, without any dramatic decision at all. Nobody decides in one moment to stop looking at their finances forever. It happens through hundreds of small postponements, each one reasonable on its own, each one part of a pattern that adds up to something much larger. This avoidance rarely comes from carelessness. Often it comes from an old wound. Perhaps you grew up in a home where money conversations meant tension or fear, or an argument you were never meant to overhear. Perhaps you once faced a financial failure that left a mark deeper than the money itself, a mark on your sense of competence, your sense of safety, your sense of being someone who is good with the practical parts of life. And so the mind, trying to protect you, decided that distance from the numbers was safer than closeness to them. But there is an old principle that wise people have returned to for generations across many different lives and many different struggles. What you refuse to look at, you cannot change. Not because looking away means the truth stops existing, but because clarity is the beginning of every meaningful decision, and avoidance keeps that beginning permanently out of reach. This principle is simple to say and difficult to live. Financial stress rarely comes only from lack of income. It often comes from the exhausting effort of managing uncertainty. The low hum of anxiety that follows a person who does not know exactly where they stand. That not knowing costs energy. It costs sleep. It costs peace. And ironically, the very habit meant to protect you from discomfort becomes the thing that guarantees more of it, stretched out over months and years instead of concentrated into one honest hour of looking. When you avoid your numbers, you are not avoiding math. You are avoiding a feeling, usually a feeling of falling short, of being behind, of not being the kind of person who has this handled. But feelings faced directly tend to lose their weight. Feelings avoided tend to grow heavier the longer they are carried in the dark. A single evening of discomfort while reviewing your real financial picture is almost always smaller than months of quiet dread carried in the background of your mind. There is also a practical cost to avoidance that goes beyond emotion. A person who does not look clearly cannot notice small leaks before they become large ones. They cannot notice a subscription quietly draining money each month, or a pattern of spending that spikes during certain emotional states, or an opportunity to redirect even a small amount towards something that matters. Clarity is not simply comforting. It is functional. It is the foundation every other financial decision depends on. There was a woman named Renata who worked as a home care aide, moving between 3 different clients across the city most days beginning before sunrise and ending after dark. She was reliable in every visible way. Her clients trusted her. Her supervisors relied on her. But for almost 2 years, Renata avoided looking closely at her own finances the way she looked closely at everything else in her work. She knew in a general sense that money was tight. She knew there was some amount left on a credit card, though she could not have said the exact figure. She knew rent took most of what she earned, and that something usually happened near the end of each month that made things stretch further than they should. But she never sat down and looked at the full picture. Opening her banking app had become something she did quickly, almost with her eyes half closed, checking only whether a payment had gone through before closing it again. Her private thought, repeated almost daily, was simple: if I look closely, I will feel like a failure. So she chose not to look, and instead carried a constant low-level anxiety that followed her from house to house, client to client, day to day. The turning point did not arrive dramatically. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening when Renata sat in her car outside her last client's home, too tired to drive yet unwilling to go home to another unopened bill. She sat in the quiet for a few minutes longer than usual, and for reasons she could not fully explain, instead of starting the engine, she opened her banking app and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, actually read the numbers instead of glancing past them. It was not as catastrophic as she feared. It was also not as fine as she had hoped. It was simply real, a number, a starting point. And strangely, the fear she had been carrying for months did not grow larger once she finally looked. It began almost immediately to shrink. That night she wrote down every expense she could recall from the past month. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. She noticed a subscription she had forgotten she was paying for. She noticed how much smaller lunches out were adding up to be. She noticed with some discomfort that she had been avoiding her credit card statement specifically because the number frightened her, and that the number, once finally seen, was smaller than the version she had been imagining in the dark. The following weeks were not glamorous. She did not become wealthy. She did not solve every problem. There were setbacks. One week she overspent again out of exhaustion, and the old instinct to hide from her own numbers rose up strongly. But this time she recognized it. She sat with the discomfort instead of closing the app. She began checking her balance each morning, not with panic, but with a steady, almost gentle curiosity, the way a person checks the weather before deciding what to wear. Slowly, something in her changed that had nothing to do with the amount of money she earned. She began speaking to herself differently. Instead of "I am bad with money," she began saying, "I am someone who looks at the truth, even when it is uncomfortable." Within 4 months, she had built a small emergency fund, modest but real. Within 7 months, she had paid down a portion of the debt that had quietly frightened her for years. The external change was real, but the deeper victory was internal. She had stopped being someone who hid from her own life and become someone who faced it, one number at a time. Perhaps some seasons of life are not asking you to earn more immediately or to solve everything at once. Perhaps they are asking you to simply look, fully and honestly, at what is already true. There is a kind of surrender in this that has nothing to do with giving up. It is the surrender of the illusion that not looking protects you. It does not protect you. It only delays the moment you must eventually face, usually at a higher emotional cost than if you had faced it early and calmly. Ancient wisdom often returns to the same idea in different forms. Stillness before action, truth before change. A quiet room before sunrise, before the noise of the day arrives, is often when the mind is most capable of facing what it has been avoiding. There is something sacred in that kind of still, not because it solves the problem by itself, but because it creates the space in which honest seeing becomes possible. If you are someone who prays, this may be a place to bring that fear honestly, not asking for money to appear, but asking for the courage to look clearly at what is already yours to face. If prayer is not part of your life, perhaps it is simply a few minutes of silence, sitting with the discomfort long enough to let it lose some of its power over you. Either way, the invitation is the same. Stop running from the number. Let it exist in the light, where it can finally be worked with instead of feared. You do not need certainty before you look. You do not need to already have the answer before you check the balance, read the statement, or add up what you actually spend in a month. Courage is not the absence of fear before an honest look. Courage is looking anyway while the fear is still present. There is a strength required here that has little to do with dramatic willpower and everything to do with small private decisions made when nobody else is watching. Nobody will know if you open your banking app tonight instead of scrolling past another distraction. Nobody will applaud you for finally reading a bill you have been avoiding for weeks. But your life will begin responding to that choice quietly, the same way it has been responding in the opposite direction to every choice to look away. If you have spent years avoiding your own numbers, this is not a life sentence. It is simply where the pattern has led so far. The years you spent avoiding are not wasted in the sense of being unusable. They are simply the evidence of a habit that is now ready to be interrupted. Regret left unmoved becomes heaviness. Regret turned into responsibility becomes fuel for a different kind of future. I am learning to face what I have been avoiding. I no longer confuse not looking with being safe. I can look at the truth of my finances without losing my worth. I am someone who chooses clarity over comfortable fog. There is a well-documented period in the life of Madam C.J. Walker, one of the first American self-made businesswomen, in which she worked as a laundress, earning barely enough to survive, while carefully saving small amounts and studying the details of a trade she intended to build a future from. She did not have the comfort of avoiding her financial reality. Poverty forced her to look directly at every dollar, every risk, every decision. What made the difference was not the absence of hardship, but her refusal to let that hardship keep her in a fog of vague hope instead of specific action. She tracked, she planned, she adjusted, and she built something lasting from a starting point most people would have considered impossible. Her example is not a promise that facing your numbers will make you wealthy. It is a reminder that clarity, however uncomfortable, is where every real change begins. There is an old story told in different forms across many traditions of a farmer who owned a field just beyond a hill near his home. For years he heard rumors about that field. Some said the soil had turned poor, others said a section had flooded, and rather than walk the short distance to see for himself, he simply believed whichever rumor frightened him most that season and planted nothing at all. One morning, an old traveler passing through asked him why the field sat empty while his neighbor's fields were full. The farmer explained his fears. The traveler said nothing in response except to gesture toward the hill and begin walking. Reluctantly, the farmer followed. When they reached the field, they found parts of the soil dry and cracked. Yes, but also large sections that were rich and ready, untouched, waiting. The farmer had spent years afraid of a field he had never actually walked into. The lesson needed no further explanation. Some of what we fear is real, some of it is not. The only way to know the difference is to walk the short distance and look. The subconscious mind does not need magic to shape a life. It only needs repetition. Every time you look away from your numbers, you are not simply avoiding one uncomfortable moment. You are reinforcing an identity, quietly telling yourself that this is not something you are capable of facing. Over time, that identity becomes familiar, and familiar things, even uncomfortable ones, feel safer than unfamiliar ones. This is why so many people can want change deeply and still, without intending to, resist the very actions that would create it. A person who repeatedly avoids checking their finances is not simply forgetting or being lazy. They are often, without realizing it, protecting a self-image that says looking closely equals failing. But identity can be rebuilt the same way it was built, through repetition, only pointed in a new direction. A person who checks their numbers daily, even briefly, even imperfectly, begins to build a different internal story. Not I am bad with money, but I am someone who stays close to the truth of my own life. This shift rarely happens in one dramatic moment. It happens through the accumulation of small, honest glances, repeated often enough that they stop feeling frightening and start feeling normal. If you feel ready to explore this work more deeply, there may be something below that can gently support the next step of this process. Tonight, before you sleep, or tomorrow morning before the day pulls you into its usual noise, there is one simple action available to you. Not 10 habits, not a complete financial plan, one action. Open your banking app or your latest statement, or whatever record holds the truth of your current situation, and read it fully, without rushing past it and without judging yourself while you do. Write down the exact number you see, not the number you assume, not the number you fear, the actual number. This single act will not fix your finances by itself, but it will interrupt the pattern that has been quietly shaping your financial life for longer than you may want to admit. It will replace vague dread with specific information, and specific information is something you can finally work with. You cannot build a plan around a feeling. You can only build a plan around a fact. Tonight or tomorrow morning, give yourself that fact. You do not need to solve everything the moment you see the number. You are not required to fix years of avoidance in a single evening. You are only required to look honestly and let that single moment of clarity become the foundation for whatever comes next. There is a kind of exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from carrying uncertainty for too long. That exhaustion often lifts, not when the financial situation becomes perfect, but when it finally becomes known. Known problems can be worked on. Known problems can be broken into steps. Unknown problems only grow heavier the longer they remain in the dark. I am willing to see what I have been avoiding. I trust myself to face the truth without losing my sense of worth. I am building a life on facts, not fear. If this reflection has stayed with you, there may be further guidance below to help you take the next honest step. You began tonight with a small tightening in your chest, a familiar discomfort you have perhaps carried for a long time without naming it clearly. That feeling was never really about the money itself. It was about the fear of what looking might reveal, and beneath that, the fear of what it might say about you. But you are not the number on a screen. You are the person capable of looking at that number without flinching, capable of sitting with discomfort long enough for it to lose its grip, capable of building something honest from wherever you actually stand tonight, rather than from the fog you have been standing in instead. You do not need to transform your entire financial life before the sun rises. You only need to stop unconsciously repeating the silent habit that has kept you stuck, one avoided glance at a time. You can begin with a single honest look. You can begin with one true number, written down, faced, and finally seen. The fog was never protecting you. It was only delaying you. Look and begin.